There's been a lot of discussion this week over Australia's lack of ambition, especially around our second Kyoto Protocol commitment. So I decided to have a chat with Michiel and Marion from Climate Analytics, who know much more about this topic than I do, and just ask them a few questions about what Australia's ambition is at the moment and if it meets our 2-degree target. So, Michiel, you've seen the Kelro submission for Kyoto Protocol this week. Does it match with a 2-degree world, and could it be better?
It certainly could be better. You can see this from different directions. I'm a climate scientist. I look at the relationship between emissions, concentrations, and ultimately warming and impacts. The easy comparison of Australia's pledge is to compare it with recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, a collection of climate scientists that make recommendations also to the negotiations process here. And in 2007 they recommended that to be on a pathway that is sort of a 2-degree consistent pathway of concentrations and warming. Developed countries as a whole have to reduce emissions by 25 to 40% below 1990. Now, the first problem with Australia's pledge is that it's not defined as an absolute level below 1990 of industrial emissions, which is what the IPCC was talking about. But instead, it is defined as a total reductions of industrial gases, emissions from deforestation, afforestation, reforestation, which is uptake, not an emission, of 5% below 2000, and in Australia's case 2000 is a lot higher than 1990. And so comparing those numbers gives an impression of where they should be heading instead of the current pledge. Another way to look at this is what we did in a project called the Climate Action Tracker. Okay. The Climate Action Tracker analyzes pledges of countries' comparison to each other, and then add it all up, run to a climate model, and say if it's sufficient for 2 degrees. In that project, we also use an estimate of what each country should do compared to other countries, so that together they solve the problem, but each does their fair share according to a set of principles like costs, emissions per capita, energy intensity of the economy, so the amount of emissions per unit of GDP, economic production. And here we concluded that Australia has to up their pledge to -25 below 2000 to come near or at their fair share of the problem. And even in the definition or the clarification of Australia's pledge, the information they gave themselves is that the 25% pledge is conditional on other countries also achieving deep reductions to, as a total, keep concentrations of greenhouse gases to 450 ppm, which is a concentration that is roughly consistent with 2 degrees, or actually it's a bit above. The 15% pledge would be consistent with, if I remember correctly, a concentration of between 510 and 540 ppm, which would roughly equate to, in the long term, a warming of 2.5 to 3 degrees. And the 5% pledge obviously is less ambitious than this and is not linked to any concentration levels. So all these three comparisons show that the 5% pledge of Australia really falls short of what is needed.
So you're saying that Australia's current pledge under the Kyoto Protocol is not getting us anywhere near 2 degrees?
Well, of course, certainly not by one country alone. But compared to what is needed on a set of objective criteria, it's not enough.
Okay. And I guess that brings into the whole scheme of things what other countries are doing. Now, Marion, you've kind of looked at what other countries are doing and what Australia should be doing comparatively and things like that. And I guess one of our conditions for the Kyoto Protocol is that other countries are making comparable emissions reductions targets. So what do you think about Australia's Kyoto submission and what other countries are doing?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting that Australia has conditioned its pledge or its target to other countries doing a comparable effort in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because if we look at it at their own presentations that they give and their own numbers in the submission, they compare their own target to a business as usual development with a projection of where emissions would be in 2020 if there's no further action taken. On the one hand, what is interesting about this approach is that in these negotiations, normally developed countries demonstrate their reductions below a certain specific year, so real measurable emissions, not below a projected pathway. And in these negotiations, normally we only do this for developing countries. So then if we allow Australia to compare themselves or to present themselves as a developing country, then the question is, how does that relate to other developing countries? And Australia shows that the 5% target would actually result in a reduction of 24% below this business as usual that they have calculated. And if we look at other countries, we have South Africa, for example, who we would, I think, assume all that is more of a developing country than Australia, has a 34% reduction pledged below business as usual. We have Brazil, who has a pledge of 36 to 39% below business as usual. Mexico has a pledge of 30% below business as usual, same as South Korea. So the question is, what would be needed from other countries more than that to be comparable to Australia, when actually a lot of the larger developing countries have actually far more ambitious targets compared to business as usual, if we allow Australia, of course, to declare themselves a developing country.
And I guess that comparison is especially interesting with countries like South Africa and Brazil also having natural resource exporting economies. So it's a very interesting comparison that you just made.
It is actually, in fact, a really interesting connection, because there are very strong similarities between Australia and South Africa in the high dependence on coal, very coal-based energy sector, very export-oriented. And on the other hand, there's very strong links between Australia and Brazil in the strong importance of the land use sector and the large uncertainties connected to all data and all accounting around the land use sector. And of course, that is also something that is one part of their target or of their calculations that's always a bit worrying or a bit difficult for us as scientists, is that numbers on land use change and forestry and land use in general are very highly uncertain, and rules are not very clear, and rules are interpreted very differently, which makes any projections on what will happen in that sector, and even just reporting on what has happened in the past, very unclear. And yeah, so that's very, very interesting, actually, that those two countries both have very strong elements of similarity to Australia.
And yet those countries, given all of the poverty concerns that they have, are still willing to make pledges that are far more significant than our own.
Yes, I mean, in the terms that Australia chooses to present its pledge, that is the case, yes.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Michiel. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I think the key message of it has been that Australia really can increase its ambition based on science and based on politics. Thank you.